everyone. Welcome to the Voice of Dr. Yan. I'm your host, Dr. Li-Meng Yan. And today we will have another guest who has been already in our podcast at the beginning of the Voice of Dr. Yan. And she is Claire Lopez. And Lopez is a national security expert. She is the founder and president of Lopez Liberty LLC. And also, she is a Middle East subject matter expert. She knows a lot about Iran, WMD, terrorism, Islam, jihad, and her expertise is, of course, in counterintelligence. And we are very happy to invite her here because now every day we hear a lot of news from both sides, Israel, U.S., as well as the terrorists, the Hamas, and also the Arabic regimes behind it, Russia, China behind it. So we have heard all this voice from both sides, and each side will claim their justice. So the thing is, we need to really understand the history and understand a lot of terms before we have an idea. I mean, of course, if you understand humanity and if you see the massacre happened in Israel, I believe you will already have your idea. You will stand on the side with Israel and the United States because this is representative of the civilized regimes. However, I mean, for a lot of people, especially when we see so many protesters in the Western countries holding the slogan that free Palestine and also the other slogans, even anti-Semitism. I mean, these are definitely something wrong in our society. And if we check on social media and even on mainstream media, we will see a lot of that kind of non-biased reports. But if you listen to them, you will realize they're delivering a lot of misinformation, or they have taught it the concept to change your idea, to especially for people who don't have the full understanding of the whole situation. It's easy for them to be misled by the propaganda and get brainwashed. So today we have Claire, and she is an expert in counterintelligence. She's an expert in Middle East issue. She's in Soviet Union, so she knows a lot candidate even before many of us have heard some of the terms. So Claire, thank you for coming. And could you initially give our audience a brief introduction about how this, I mean, we hear a lot of organizations like Hamas, Jihad, like the Hezbollah, and also we always have things that people connect them with Iran and with even with Russia and with all these regimes. The same suddenly get together for these terrorist campaigns. So could you give us an introduction to let people know the connections behind it and among these campaigns, why they suddenly will become all together and start to shout in front of us in the stage?
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm very glad to be with you once again. I appreciate the chance to speak with your audience. So when we look at the Middle East area of what we might call the Levant, Levant is a word from the French, really, meaning the rising of the sun. In other words, it refers to the East, okay? So historically, this area, I think we should maybe go back to the Ottoman Empire. Let's start there. And before World War I, at the beginning of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was called the sick man of Europe. It was already collapsing. It was falling apart. And then after World War I, it did fall apart, and Turkey was on the losing side of that war. Now, during the centuries of the Ottoman Empire, though, Turkey ruled big parts of the Middle East, the entire Levant. Levant encompassed not just what we would call Turkey today, what used to be called Syria or Greater Syria, that's Al-Sham in Arabic, and on down the Mediterranean coast, inwards all the way, let's say, to Mesopotamia, which would mean Iraq today, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. All of that was ruled at one time by the Ottoman Empire that fell apart after World War I. And after World War I, the powers, the Allied powers that won the war, got together and said, look, the Levant has been the homeland of the Jewish people for 3,500 years, going back to the Bible, the Old Testament or the Tanakh. And they should have the right, now that the land is freed from the Ottoman Empire, to establish their own homeland, their own nation state in the Levant once again. And so the League of Nations gave authority over the Levant, divided it really between the French and the British. The French were given responsibility, what you might call Greater Syria, or, well, kind of used to be Syria. There is no more Syria. Lebanon, that was for the French. They administered it. It was their mandate from the League of Nations. But the parts of the Levant that today include the Jewish state of Israel, Jordan, and Gaza as well, were given to the British in what was called the British Mandate for Palestine. Now, where did that word Palestine come from? Well, it comes from the Bible too. In ancient times, after the Trojan Wars, the people who participated in those wars kind of dispersed around the islands of the Mediterranean Sea. And they went in different directions, and some of them came to the southern coastline of the Mediterranean Sea. They were called the Sea People. And they were Indo-European people, not Middle Eastern people at all. But they had the name in the Old Testament of the Philistines. And as we know from the Bible, they were the enemies of the Israelite people of the Old Testament. And that is where our story of David and Goliath comes from, remember. And so eventually, though, the peoples of the Levant, except for the Jewish people, were assimilated and basically disappeared. They were absorbed into the bigger, broader Israelite, Hebrew-speaking population, the Canaanites, the Jebusites, the Amalekites, and the Philistines. Well, fast forward to the Roman Empire, which was trying to rule over what they called Judea for the Jewish people, wanted to obliterate the identity of the Jewish people. And so they the Romans renamed the area after the Jews' ancient enemy, the Philistines. That's where the name comes from, Philistine. And that is how the name came to be associated with the Jewish homeland, the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people. But by the way, are the only people in the history of the world that ever had a kingdom in the Levant, ever had a capital, the eternal and undivided capital of Jerusalem. It's never been the capital of anybody else except the Jewish people. But the Romans made this name stick. Okay, now let's fast forward back again. We were talking about the beginning of the 20th century when the Ottoman Empire collapsed. The British were given the British Mandate for Palestine, and that's where the name comes from. That land included all of what is today the modern-day state of Israel, plus Gaza, plus all of Jordan. But what happened is that the British were sympathetic to the Hashemite clan that used to rule over Mecca in what is today Saudi Arabia. But when Ibn Saud unified the tribes of the peninsula and took over Mecca, Ibn Saud's tribe kicked out the Hashemites who had been the sheriffs of Mecca for many centuries. And the British sympathized with them because they had fought with them against the Turkish Ottoman Empire. And so what the British immediately did with the entire mandate for Palestine, which was designated legally by the League of Nations for the Jewish people, it was split in half by the British, and half to what is today Jordan. And King Abdullah today is the grandson of the King Abdullah, his grandfather, to whom the British originally gave that land. So that is how the land came to be split. Fast forward once again to after the League of Nations, after World War II, the United Nations succeeded the League of Nations, but adopted all of the League of Nations provisions about the Middle East, about the Levant, about the British mandate for Palestine. And even though they agreed to allow that half of it to go over to the brand new country that had never existed before of Jordan, they supported the United Nations, just like the League of Nations before it, supported the establishment of a Jewish state in the ancient land of Israel, Eretz Israel, and therefore offered in 1947 to split this land once again, the leftover land after Jordan was already taken, to split it again in two, and half for the Arabs who were not native to the region. They had come in from Jordan and Lebanon and Syria and Iraq and Egypt. They weren't native to the region at all, but they were there to split that land between those Arabs and the Jewish people. Immediately, the Jewish people, with David Ben-Gurion as their leader, said, yes, we'll take it, we'll establish a modern-day state of Israel. But the Arabs immediately said, no, we can't have all of it. If we can't murder all the Jews and drive them into the sea, we don't want a country either. And they launched a war. 5 armies invaded Israel on the day of its birth in May of 1948 and attacked it. That was Israel's War of Independence, which they won. And so that is how the modern day state of Israel came to be. But those Arabs, aside from Jordan and Egypt, which both made peace treaties with Israel in later years, 1978 Egypt and 1994 Jordan, the others never really made peace with the Jewish state of Israel. And the Soviet Union you asked about, back in the time of the Soviet Union, and then Russia too, meddled in the Middle East and provided support. Yevgeny Primakov was the KGB chief, and before that he was the Soviet foreign minister. And they provided aid and assistance, money, training, weapons to Middle East terror groups like the Palestinian Liberation Organization under Yasser Arafat, who, by the way, was born in Cairo, Egypt, and even to organizations which were not Islamically based, like the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine under George Habash, a secular, not an Islamic organization, but provided the support to these terror groups in hopes of opposing Israel in a way that would diminish United States' influence in the region. And the United States, of course, from the beginning, from President Harry Truman on through to the current day, fully support the Jewish state of Israel. Soviet Union, Russia wanted to drive a wedge in there. That's why they founded, armed, trained Islamic and other terror groups in the Middle East. A lot of that training took place in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. There is where Sunnis and Shiites came together. The followers of the then, at that time, exiled Ayatollah Khomeini were there, as well as Sunnis, including the Muslim Brotherhood, and the PLO and the PFLP and many more. But the KGB was the one training them in terror operations. So with that as the background, maybe we can go to any more questions, but that's the historical background. And we fast forward to today and understand that Iran is now the number one state sponsor of terror designated by the United States Department of State in the world, and arms, funds, trains under its aegis many of these these Middle Eastern Islamic Jihad groups, like Hamas, which has been ruling in Gaza, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, a Shiite group, also like Hezbollah over Lebanon and under Iran's leadership and authority rules Lebanon now. And the Hashd Shabi, as they're called, or the Popular Mobilization Units, these Shiite militia groups that are attacking American troops right now in Iraq and also in Syria. They are the, ideological successors to all that history I just went through. But the history is firmly based in the Quran, and that is from the time of Muhammad, back in the 7th century, who obliterated the Jewish tribes on the peninsula that came to be known as the Arabian Peninsula, wiped out the Banu Nadir, Banu Kinuka, Banu Qurayza, these three very large and peaceful, prosperous Jewish tribes on the peninsula. That's all in the Quran. It's also in the Sirah Rasulallah, and that means the biography of Muhammad, as brought to us in translation by Ibn Ishaq, the story of the enmity of Muhammad and early Islam to the Jewish people. Why? Because they did not want to convert to Islam. They wanted to remain Jewish. To this day, that's why Hamas fights, Hezbollah fights, that's why Palestinian Islamic Jihad fight. It is because the Jewish people do not accept Islam. They will not convert. They want to be Jewish. And so, if you look at the Hamas covenant and other documents of these Islamic Jihad groups, you will see statements like in the Hamas covenant, which says, Israel exists and shall exist until Islam will obliterate it as it has obliterated others before it. That's in the opening lines of the Hamas 1988 covenant. So let me stop there because maybe there are some questions from all of that.
Oh, yes, thank you so much. I do have a lot of questions for you because there are a lot of new concepts for us every day when we listen to the news and also go to check some materials and realize, oh, there's something new I never thought about. Oh, this is something I thought already is in the history, but why suddenly come back? I mean, for example, Claire, I have read that actually anti-Semitism is a term started from the at the end of 1800 in Russia. At that time, Russia actually has this kind of policies, anti-Jewish people, and later Soviet Union, Lenin and Stalin, they adopted it. And then because they don't want to be the same as Nazis, so they use the anti-Zionist to replace this concept. So my question is, yes, it explains why Russian, now previous Soviet Union, behind these Islam terrorist organizations against Israel. However, for Hamas or Jihad or this kind of terrorist organization, we are all infidel, right? No matter Catholic, Christian, even the communist, they are the infidel. So when these extremist Islam terrorists, they define everyone else as infidel, how could those communist regime balance the relation with this terrorist organization? Because they should know that one day they are all the targets.
Yes, I see what you're saying exactly. And I think the answer to that is that Sometimes policies are followed because they are opportunistic for the moment. They'll settle up later on between what we might call the Reds and the Greens, the communist Marxists versus Islam. And by the way, going back to the origin of this hatred, it's not extreme. It's not radical at all. If we look at the canon, the documents of Islam, the Quran, the Hadiths, the sayings of Muhammad, the Sirah, as we mentioned, the biography of Muhammad, the tafsirs, the commentaries on the Quran, they are all in agreement that the infidel, they would call that the kuffar in plural, must be fought and killed wherever they may be found. And so that is the origin of the hatred of Jews. Now, after the Romans and so many others in other places and throughout history expelled the Jewish people from their homeland, from where other places they were living. They started pogroms and genocide against the Jewish people. The Jewish people fled in many different directions, and they settled in many different places. Those who remained, and Jews have always lived in the land of Israel, those who remained and their descendants are called Mizrahi Jews. Those who settled in other parts of the Middle East, around Middle East, North Africa, up into the Iberian Peninsula, today Spain and Portugal, are called Sephardim, Jewish people. And others fled even farther afield and went up into Europe, Eastern Europe, and Russia. And these are the Ashkenazi Jews. And these three are all Jewish people. They share the exact same genetic mitochondria. Those tests have been done lately to show that every single one of those groups is identical in the mitochondria of the DNA to the original Jewish people of biblical times. But because they were often strangers in the lands where they went, and lived according to their own principles, their own biblical principles, they were often seen as other, as outsiders, and they were discriminated against. And from this discrimination come the pogroms. And so that is where some of the anti-Semitism comes from. Now, Semite simply means people of the Semitic language group. And honestly, that would include Arabic speakers, and formerly Syro-Aramaic speakers and so forth. But as applied today, that term is applied and means to the Jewish people. Now, the other term, as you just said, Dr. Yen, is that they were trying, some people were trying to replace anti-Semitism. Well, no, we don't oppose the Jewish people. We just oppose the Jewish people who want to live in the ancestral homeland of their people. In other words, Zionists. And so the term anti-Zionist comes into play. Zionist simply means the Jewish people with an attachment to their ancestral homeland, the homeland of 3,500 years of the ancestors of the Jewish people. That's what that means. But that's where those terms come from. But throughout history, there has been vicious Jew hatred, which of course is doctrinal to Islam. I mean, it's obligatory to the doctrine of Islam, but is now unfortunately shared by way too many people around the world. And we're seeing these horrific protests and demonstrations springing up all over, including right here in the United States and on our college campuses, with the most despicable slogans and signs and placards being waved about. And in places like Paris and Berlin, people are once again marking the homes of Jewish people with the Star of David. If you can even imagine such a thing, this is going on.
Thank you so much. Actually, when I saw these videos about the protest against Israel and anti-Semitism and also Free Palestine, and they doing some violent things to defend their kind of ideology. Or I could say most of these people even don't have some ideology. They just pour some slogans and they thought that means freedom, liberty, or whatever, but they Palestine or this kind of word totally opposite to freedom, to what kind of they expected. I mean, so in this, I need to talk about propaganda effect. All these campaigns, especially for the young people, for the Western people who actually have no idea about real communism or the real, this kind of religious countries, regimes. They don't have idea how people suffered, especially like women or LGBTQ people or, infidel, together, all the infidels, what they would suffer in such regimes. And before that, we have to have a short break. And could you, I think we could have 1 more minute before the short break. And would you get some very brief word you want to deliver to those protesters who now support Hamas, support these terrorism people?
Sure. We can go into this in more detail after the break, but we should talk about where Hamas itself comes from. It is, of course, on the United States Foreign Terrorist Organizations list, and for good reason. And Hamas is the Gaza branch of the Egyptian, originally, jihadist Muslim Brotherhood, which has a presence through front groups all over America and on American university campuses, sad to say.
Thank you. So let's have a short break and we will go back, continue our conversation. Thank you.